Oh, okay. I'm just saving my notes. Oh. Nope. The next item is Board of Education goal update, the framework and metrics. Board goal number 2 is the monitoring and implementation of the racial equity policy 7:12 states that the board will develop an accountability framework of measurable outcomes guided by the implementation, accountability, and monitoring section for racial equity policy 7:12. So tonight, the board, we're going to have a discussion about the metrics and framework that will be used to guide our work in implementing the procedures that will ensure that the policy is being implemented. What our goal is to capture what you're saying. I'm going to take them from my side, and Ms. Sullivan is going to take those as the board is having their discussion and capture them on the screen.
So we are charged with the monitoring of our policy, and it was intentional in flipping the discussions. We didn't do it A-B, but you all get the gist of it. I will open it up to comments. I will be honest, I'm feeling a little bereft right now of needing a little more meat to be able to speak to this, but perhaps others have some direction.
I don't know if it's direction, Jackie, but I think what we should settle on, in addition to the broad overarching goal, right, of eliminating this, is incremental goals. We should know what outcomes we're looking to see, right, and then reason backwards. I mean, given the process, how quickly do we want to start seeing, or can we rationally expect to see improvement there, and what does that improvement look like? So I think that might be the way to go. We have a number of different things. CCP has identified a number of different things that are the outcomes, and maybe that's where we start and say these are the outcomes we expect. What period of time should we start seeing gains? Which should come first, second, third, that kind of thing.
Yes, I guess I feel like we're chasing our tail a little bit here until we have something that's we're either allowing the administration to do this work so that we can talk about what the something has to be able to inform, or we're doing it in reverse and guiding the process. And I don't know which one we're kind of double dipping. So I'm a little frustrated that we have made recommendations through CCB as well as other places, and the targets that we're talking about, I imagine that we have some more procedural items to as metrics to be able to tag on to outcomes. But we don't. So to your point, Ralph, we had the CCB, the broader outcomes. I looked at it. I feel like we need a little more information, but that, I think the CCB recommendations are those outcomes. Perhaps we can delineate those a little bit more in terms of the timeline piece.
I think we're going to have to, right? And then, you know, the implementation, of course, is up to the administration, and the recommendations are going to come out of the process at the administration is going through, and that we just heard they're working through the process, and they're putting in the lens and then putting in procedures for implementing what they discovered through the lens. And all that has to, though, be happening within the context of, by the way, here are your outcomes, and we expect achievement of these outcomes and seeing progress in this period of time and this period of time, so that the report back would be, all right, let's pick one of the outcomes, disciplinary, changes in the disproportionate disciplinary outcomes we're seeing now. We would like to see a reduction of X% within the next 24 months, and that you, administration, tell us what you're implementing to do to get there, and then report back on how well you're achieving that goal, and let us know if your implementation is not achieving that goal, and then you can change course to fix it to get there. I think it's that kind of thing we have to do. I think the board has to start setting those measurable time periods and expectations in place, and then the appropriate role of the administration is filling in the how they get there.
This is specific, and I think the strategic plan already reflects those outcomes. This is specific to the racial equity policy, and that's why I think I'm struggling a little bit, because the things that, in terms of cultural pedagogy, the welcoming environment, all of those things, what are we've kind of set out the goals there, and I'm just feeling like I need a little more information as to beyond what we've already said. Yes.
So Jackie, help me out. I mean, sorry, I can't really understand. Here's a set of outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And then we have a racial equity policy going in place, which is really a lens, a framework, a process
Right.
to review it, just intended to focus on those same outcomes. And I'm struggling a little bit with what you're struggling with, in the sense that you're waiting to see something out of the racial equity policy. But help me understand, what are you waiting to see?
Being informed by, and I will use as the example when we had the gender equity procedures. We had the policy and we had those procedures. That was the kind of the guidelines. So these are the procedures, and being able to attach to that the expectations for, in terms of the timeline, as well as kind of the impact. And so with the racial equity policy, I'm thinking about the broad implications of what it means to look at this through a racial equity lens, and the levels that have to do with climate, stakeholders. Do we want to say that, our expectation, to Ralph's point, something about discipline? I'm waiting to hear, not waiting to hear. I am hoping that the direction that the board will give in terms of the outcomes and some of the potential metrics has to do with things like, Gina, to your point, having multiple languages for our community that we do our communications in, that we're talking about with the pedagogy, and not just the instructional materials, but also curriculum and instruction. What can we expect that that will be reflected, and I don't know if it may be in the curriculum manual, but how do we identify that our, an example, that if a class is being taught a book by Toni Morrison, that it is as impactful as something that is by Jane Austen, and that students feel that they are being not only represented, but having those types of, conversations. So that's what I mean, Bill.
Yeah.
We talked about the systemic barriers.
If I might interject, it's almost as though we're having two conversations. The policy is one thing, the procedure is another. If the board has a vision for as Mr. Martiri said, some of those things that have come out of CCB. Achievement data, where we want to be at a certain point in time, a reduction in discipline data, increase in student attendance using the positive framework. The racial, that's a goal that to me can be tied to the strategic plan. Okay, that's there. When we talk about this procedure versus transgender, the sex equity procedure, we are using that process to develop the procedure. However, this procedure is significantly different in that it has 12 different components, and each of those components will look different based upon what the section of the policy says it should address. And true, today you have a rough draft of that. We've heard that it needs to be broken down and more. But the other thing about the board can set us a goal where they want to see progress. But the thing about a policy, a procedure is it is ongoing. It is never ending.
Right.
And so the board can say, this is what we want, because the actual board policy, the board goal speaks to the policy, not the procedure. And if the board wants us to achieve academic indicators, attendance indicators, discipline indicators, by this particular time, then I see our role as an administration is to come back and report out routinely as to where we are at specific benchmarks in time. That's not something we can do every month because you have to set it. And if you give us that framework this year, we need to be able to say where we are at this point in time. That's our baseline. And then we move forward to accomplish that over time. So what I'm saying is we put into, and not in great detail yet, into the procedures some metrics, some data points that we think will show we're progressing there, and some evidence of that, because we also realize there's going to be some qualitative and some quantitative data. That, to me, will help support what we're doing to get to where the board wants us to be, but does not isolate that. And so that's why I say it's almost like we're having two conversations about what we want. And so there's one aspect of the procedure and what the data points and the evidence we will look to see if we're really implementing the procedures. And then there's the overarching equity metrics and benchmarks that the board wants us to accomplish as a district.
And that's well said. And so for the way these, in my mind, the way they work together, the board should be in the position of setting the broader goals and the time periods, and the administration should be in control of the procedures how to get there. And then the report back are just ways to check in, because as you're right, a procedure goes on forever, unless it shouldn't, right? Unless you catch that it's not working, and then you modify it. And the only way you know it's not working is in light of the bigger objectives the board wants to attain by certain specified periods of time. So that gives the administration the capacity to have an additional monitoring piece when you're looking at how well your implementation of the procedures are working, right?
But I do think it would help us to know the board's focus or the board's broader goal of what you want us to accomplish, so that we can make sure that that's reflected, is what I hear you also saying, in the procedure.
So what I'll use a slightly different language for me. One is, from a board standpoint, I think we have outcome metrics.
Right.
Metrics that the CCB has, that the strategic
Correct.
plan has. And what we want to do is know progress on those metrics and see that occur.
Right.
This racial equity policy or procedure has process metrics.
Correct.
How much have we changed curriculum? How have we broken down barriers? These are things we can monitor, but there are hundreds of them in terms of different options within it. And maybe we can choose to monitor, and I could actually challenge whether it's the board's role to monitor those at all. But so those are, to me, we're talking at two different levels.
And that's what
And-
kind of what I
right.
was saying, is two different things.
And I guess what I'm hearing Jackie, you say is, well, where are some of these process metrics? Or is that what I'm hearing you say, or am I hearing you say something different?
In terms of the racial equity policy and which is written into the policy, monitor implementation of racial equity policy. Your point is the point, that there are a myriad of things. But to date, those are very amorphous. So it's hard to hone in on, I was expecting that we would be able to have some identification of the areas that, because there are 12 components, and that there would be some that were fleshed out enough for us to be able to say for this year, because these are our board goals for this year, this is what we will, target, identify, be able to provide timeline. That's why I was asking about timeline as well. Because right now they're, for this work.
So in that case, I guess I would say administration, you're developing these. Please tell me a handful of process metrics that you're going to follow to know whether this procedure is working or not.
And that we started putting in that column. The procedure is the day-to-day work that we do. But what I hear, and what I came into the meeting was that the board wanted to give us, this is where we want you to be 5 years down the road. And then our job is to make the processes make it happen.
Correct.
And, go ahead.
I think for me, what keeps coming up is if we're monitoring the policy. So then my question is, when are the procedures expected to be in place so that we can actually see outcomes, right? So if are we having an expectation that we're spending this entire year fleshing out the rest of the procedures and the policy pieces so that we can begin? I'm mindful of the time.
In August, when we presented the timeline, because there were so many components that would look different from each other, we actually did the timeline to take us through this year, with the notion that as we were able to tighten pieces, we wouldn't wait till the end of the year to say we're going to now implement everything. We would implement. The one you saw that is the most developed is the racial incident protocol. That's because we want to get that in place as soon as we possibly can in the second semester, as we still work through the other pieces. If we go back to what we did with the sex equity policy, the procedure, it took us a year to do that and flesh it out to the degree that we thought we had it, where we could implement it and begin to see some change. And so wanted to also be deliberate in this. And as you heard today, even with the 6 we have, there's still some questions that need to be answered to tighten that up. And we could have come to the board today with something on everything that we ourselves didn't even believe it was to the point of bringing that to you. So where you see there are places that say in progress, that's not to say nothing's happened. It is like as you know, at CCB, we talked about revamping the school code, the student code of conduct. And so they're still working on that with the goal of bringing it back early spring. So it's approved for next year. So it's kind of a scaffolded process that as things get more finite and deliberate, then that is pushed out. Was that?
I totally get that, but I'm thinking like, yes, and. I'm thinking yes, and, right? All of that. And the spaces where we know that students are still having experiences that are contrary to what we would like them to experience, right? How is the policy beginning to affect those spaces, and how are we monitoring the effectiveness of those pieces, right? So that we're able to see that it's actually having an impact in the school for the students.
I could give you examples, just sitting here giving you some. We initially struggled with getting the restorative practices up and running. And now that is something that as we have every incident that comes by us, we actually look at it more critically and try to ensure that at some point that there's some restorative work done with students and with faculty and staff. You heard some of that today. So we didn't wait for that one as a part of student code of conduct, but it actually serves for us as a place of saying, well, this worked. Maybe we need to tweak this before we put it in the document. And so there are things that we're actually doing now that are helping us to flush out what should happen.
Yeah, and I'm of course knowing that there are lots of things that are already happening and in progress, and that all of these things are being done that we're talking about. It's, if we're monitoring it, how are we getting that information back on what's being done and that we're monitoring it? So
That's what we really need to be more, if I hear you, more deliberate.
Yeah, that's where my thinking is anyway. Like, there are things that are happening under each of those 12 aspects. How are we knowing that those aspects of the policy?
One of the things I would also suggest, the first section is about accountability and monitoring. And the language that the committee put in there, if you had that grid that was there, it speaks to strategic plan as a way of making sure that we hold ourselves accountable and talk to the board. But it also talked about taking whatever accountability framework you develop for us to making sure that that's tied to the accountability in that first one. And so it says annually. We may want to change that because it's still a draft, and say that that's done more regularly than once a year to report on this policy in terms of accountability. Because the way we read it is the accountability is not just for that section. When we report out, it's accountability for all of the sections that are being implemented and bringing you the evidence and the data to show that we're making that progress. That one we actually held off on completing at this point in time because we want to get through the others to see what are some of the other metrics and forms of accountability to get that done.
Which is sort of our responsibility, right? So that gets back to us setting these time deadlines and for the outcomes. And that's really our big job, our job. And then when that job is done by us, we should probably put that up for discussion and voting on sooner than later. Then the administration has an idea for the timelines and what the board expectations are, and that will impact which procedures and policies the administration highlights and goes on first, et cetera, correct?
The other thing that we see it doing is, you know how we annually review the strategic plan and make changes? This would be the perfect roadmap, since equity is the number one priority. That conversation and these, because every single component in the procedure impacts at least one or more priorities on the strategic plan. The one that talks about I'm gonna pull it off the top of my head because I don't have it in front of me. The one about the workplace is tied to goal 3, transformative leadership. That also covers the PD piece, because there's a component here for professional development that we didn't present because each of the sections requires professional development. So that will also be done. There's a piece in here about infrastructure for positions and finance that we have not done yet, because as we go through everything else, then we'll know what we need to put that in. But that each one of those ties to the strategic plan. Not just the overarching racial equity goal of number 1, but also number 2, transformative education, which also is the holistic piece, how kids come in and go out. And it's also that supportive learning environment piece that's there. The diverse workplace is number 3. And then where we have the facilities piece, the professional development piece, the finance piece, and even there's a piece about the welcoming environment that's tied to Project 1. As you look into the procedures that will be priority area 4. So I think what we get from the board in terms of how you want to hold us accountable for this, along with the identifying metrics that we put in the procedure, will help us to frame how we move forward from here on with the strategic plan.
So here's my suggestion. I think a starting place is the CCB recommendations. I think that we Ralph, to your point, January, we have this discussion with dates, because, and I know my frustration is showing, so I'm not even gonna try to hide it. This has been a recurring kind of conversation about, outcomes and metrics, and, it's clear that we need a more defined, set of outcomes with a timeline and to inform, some of the work. And I would ask, because we're going to conclude this discussion, that I know there are 6 procedures that were talked about today, if it would be helpful to know how those are being prioritized, so that if we talk about outcomes, we're not, setting anybody up to fail by honing in on something that is not the purview of the administration for this year.
So I just make sure I got everything.
Mm-hmm.
So prior to the January, or in preparation for the January town meeting, we want to have a prioritized list of the 6.
Of those 6, what's the, some are more fleshed out than others, maybe there's more that, but if we're going to speak to the monitoring.
And then, because I don't think everybody knows the CCB recommendations, so they need to have that. Members of the board.
Yes.
Overview.
Anything else that in preparation? The CCB recommendations, and I guess it would help if you know where we are with those. CCB recommendations and prioritization of the 6 sections.
So can I add, the prioritization of the 6 to me, the logical thing here is I want to know when each of these sections is finished and you're implementing. That's accountability level 1. What date is it going to be finished and what date are you going to start implementing? Accountability measure 2 is when you start implementing, you tell me what metrics you're going to use to follow that process, and then we will monitor those metrics. But the first step is, when is it finished? And committing to when is it finished.
And that's the timeline.
And that's the timeline. So it's a clear timeline of when it's finished, and finished means it's being used, and you've identified the metrics by which you're going to monitor its implementation.
Right.
This is at the level of the procedure, the monitoring the equities procedure. Now the CCB thing is the next level up.
Right.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Karen, you can compare them.
Yeah. Okay, where are we now? We are at our action items. So I will move for approval of the levy as presented and ask for a second.
Second.
Now we will discuss. Hi, how are you? Good evening. Good evening. Thank
So, when we did the levy, we did the resolutions.
Oh, wow.
You guys are not going back to me. So when we worked on this, what we did is, normally when you're going and you are presenting the resolution and adopting the levy, normally if you have any abatements, you would deduct that from your levy. But for transparency's sake, what we were actually showing was the levy at the full amount, and then we did a resolution then behind it for the abatement of the 1.7. And I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about a couple of things that went into the levy. For our levy here, what we had was the CPI of 1.9%. We had 2 expiring TIFs, we had new property, and we also had the property tax relief grant. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the property tax relief grant. And with the property tax relief grant, I had called the Cook County clerk, and I had also called the Illinois State Board and asked them about the grant and if we still needed to abate money back, because that's what that was. That grant is what we did last year, was had to abate back $5.8 million. When I spoke to them, they said that they no longer consider us having this grant anymore. So if we abate, that is our choice to go ahead and abate, but that would have to come from our funds. When we did this last year, what happened is after we were done with the abatement, they allowed us to go back to our extension from last year. Because they said that what they were looking at is they said that they weren't going to punish districts for actually giving taxpayers relief. So that's what they did. They allowed us to go back. In fact, they automatically did it. Going forward with that, when we look at the 1.7, then I'm going to talk a little about the abatement. So looking at that, we can look at one of 2 things with that. One is it could be the difference between what was the property tax that we actually abated for last year and what we received from last year to this year. Or the other side of it is you look at the TIF and it's 1/2 of what the TIF actually is for the abatement. So I just wanted to point that out when we were looking at this, because when I actually wrote up the paperwork, I wrote it up more or less as for the property tax relief grants. When you look at the property tax relief grant, this year too is also going to be our highest year that we have as far as our extension, which would be $73 million. Anything we abate back after this year will lower us down. So by abating the 1.7, that's perpetual and will go on forever. That will just always be amounts of money that the district has given back to the taxpayer.
I just want to clarify a statement. Last year was the property tax relief grant.
Correct.
This year it's just tax abatement,
Correct.
not a tax relief grant. I just want to be clear on that.
The 5.8 was actually the property tax relief grant.
Right.
This year the
That's what I'm saying.
1.7 is just a
That's what I want to clear up that.
So that's why I said I wrote the paper, thank you. When I wrote it up, I wrote it up as the property tax, but it's really not the property tax. It is an abatement that the board was looking at, for the taxpayers to give back. So I just wanted to point that out. And again, too, I just wanted to point out too that 1.7 is something that's perpetual that will go on. So, yeah, I don't know if there's any questions, but I'm asking for the abatement, or sorry, the levy to be adopted tonight.
I just want a quick clarification. The $3.7 million that we received from the state this April or so, right? Through that initial year, what's the status for this coming year? Will we be receiving anything in that regard at all this coming year?
This coming year, 19, you mean 20 or 21? Right now, are we receiving it? Yes.
And will that continue?
Yes. And when I called the Illinois State Board and asked them about that, they said that we are no longer considered as receiving a grant. That is something they said, if you thought it was too good to be true, it really is too good to be true. You are going to continue to receive that
Right.
evidence-based funding, not for a
Right.
property tax.
I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that it is now in our evidence-based funding.
Yes.
Base funding now.
Right.
Right, yes.
And evidence-based funding based on, and because we are one of the more well-to-do districts, we get hardly anything anyway.
Correct.
So that's, to me, a negligible factor that it's hardly evidence-based funding. The point is, we're still getting the money, we can call it what it is, but the point is it's still an income flow into our district. So it's-
Correct.
thank you.
But that would be the same, but that would also be the same as if, let's say, we started receiving Title III funds. That would also be an additional fund that we would be receiving for something that we needed to use it for. So this is the same with the evidence-based funding at the time we receive it.
I think one of the things, though, that if you recall, when you first presented the information, we were saying, well, if it's in the evidence-based funding, how do we then say we're abating it? And what we learned was we would actually be abating it from our,
Our education,
Our
because
education.
that's how you receive them.
So that's why we're talking about the
Yeah.
abatement.
And so the abatement that occurred the past year, we were able to go back up to our prior baseline. This year, with an abatement, we would not be able to do that.
Correct,
So it changes, as you said, forevermore.
correct.
That's from that point forward, that'll be the pivot foot, to use a basketball analogy for those who might follow that more. And so the 1.7 this year is in a way greater than the 5.8 last year, roughly, that we abated. Over time, it'll exceed 5.8 million in terms of practical impact.
I think what he's saying, if we continue to do 1.7 every year,
Yes.
it will ultimately be higher than what we initially, right, the one
Yes,
time.
because the 1.7 will perpetually be in there now. That 1.7 will forever be there.
Right.
And that will cause our base each year to go down.
If it will, yeah, it won't cause the base to go down. What'll happen is you could, so let's think of it this year. You received 73, you're doing the 1.7, it gives you 71.3. So next year I'm at 71.3, I can go ahead and abate back, but now I already gave the 1.7. Now you basically doubled it up to 3.4.
Right, so right, even with no further abatement in future years, the practical effect of abating any month this year means that money we forego moving forward into the next millennium or beyond.
Yes.
Okay.
Which was, which we had a choice of taking, we looked at what we could tax from a levy standpoint. And then we chose to reduce that by something, no matter how we choose to reduce it, whether we choose to reduce it by CPI, we choose to reduce it by not taking the TIF, or whether we choose to reduce it by abating, they are all permanent impacts on our future taxing ability. We chose not 800 from the TIF, we chose 1.7 from basically our just fund balance.
Correct,
Our continue off of our fund balance going forward.
yes.
And that's,
In not just this year, but forevermore.
Exactly, yes, thank you. Go ahead, Tom.
which, I think it gets confusing because of this scheme and the environment we're in because of the tax laws of how we've chosen to provide tax relief. What might be helpful is kind of going through a little bit of a walk down memory lane, just to kind of paint the picture of what's been done, because there are a lot of mixed pieces. Would you like to do that? Or you want?
Can I just,
Good.
Tom, you have been here as long as I have, and,
Tonight?
but,
I got here before you.
so you've been here longer than I have tonight. But I do want to just provide the context for that walk in that, a lot of the public comments that we've been hearing have, understandably, there are more than one taxing body in Oak Park, this board, and what we're doing, what we do is based on school law, which is different than what the village could do, different than the library or other taxing bodies. But the clear thing that, as all those things, from a taxpayer standpoint, when you get your tax bill, is just one number. And in the state of Montana, and I'm going to ask about this, they delineate which each taxing body, what it goes to, and the percentages. And I think that's brilliant, and it may allow for a little more, it would be helpful for me as a taxpayer. But I just want to say that we have, when you do your look down memory lane, it has been about needs, not wants. And of all of the taxing bodies, we have provided tax relief to our taxpayers. So, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, because I have a little bit of a preview here. Because our taxes are high, and our fund balance is high. And so there has been a concerted effort to provide tax relief, to right-sizing the fund balance while protecting this community asset. And it's one that's required a lot of adjustment because things change. We're not always where we need to be, but it is a process and a journey that's not just willy-nilly. And so here's the last 2013 is the beginning, because that's where we started, okay? And in 2013 was when the Financial Advisory Committee set forward a path, and the first action taken by the board at that time was a $10 million one-time abatement, as well as a $2.5 million debt service abatement. So both of those it's a one-time deal because of the way the look-back provision works. So that was $12.5 million that year. The following year, and there was no CPI that year, which compounded times, which is one of those ones that for $1 million that year, that's yielded $1 million times 7 years. So that one, that's a different type of tax relief. The difference between a one-time abatement, and something that ultimately just drops the overall tax rate. Those are the two different tools we've used. So that was in year one was the $12.5 million. Year two was a little more than that, just because of the provisions of the way we had to be a little bit lower than the first year. So I think it was 10.225 million plus the $2.5 million plus the CPI. So that was the second tax relief, and those were both to jolt and get the fund balance. And that was a $25 million between the two. At that point, because of the law, we looked back and went back to 2012 level, but still abated $2.5 million of debt service. So even in looking back, we did not take the max. Okay, and I think the key point is that up till 2012, the philosophy was to take the max. And to be candid, since 2012, the recommendation from the administration has been to take the max, and it's been through the board's efforts, et cetera, to say we can't do that. So in 2015 was just an abatement of debt service, as was the case in 2016. So that's another $2.5 million. In 2017, there was actually then foregoing what was a little around CPI at the time of a 2.1% increase. And the difference between that and the other abatements was that is like this year, that was a permanent tax reduction. So that $2 million has materialized to about 11 over the last 5 years. So that's the difference, and that's that third year look back. Last year, we abated back the $5.8 million, which was for one time. So that's the last 6 years, and even with that, we are sound, and in my opinion, we need to continue to take action. And so the recommendation on the table here is to reduce our tax by 1.7 million, which will, over the next 6 years, equate to an even $10 million in tax relief. So that's the proposal, but just to put it in a historical perspective, the other historical perspective is, the net impact of all those is that our tax in 2018 was actually lower than our taxing in 2012. Doesn't mean that they were low. They're high. They are high. But that's the action, and when it is all grouped into what others are doing, that's what this board has done. And I will tell you personally, this will be the seventh year is to not take the maximum and to provide tax relief, which I believe in, and I'm not done. I got at least one more year.
At least.
No. Okay. So that's the historical perspective, and so this one, it's been a combination of one-time issues which just drop the fund balance, and these tax cuts that drop the slope and change it. And we've used a lot of the abatements to drop it, because that way you're not necessarily shocking the patient and putting it into immediate deficit spending. This $1.7 million reduction will immediately put the district into a deficit spending mode, which, from my perspective, is healthy, because to me it forces them to focus on what it really needs to be the focus, which is spending, spending, spending. And that was what needs to be addressed. And get the spending, and that the future change is spending needs to be brought in line so that deficit spending doesn't occur as we continue to provide relief.
I don't really have anything to
Oh, I
add.
thought you were gonna.
I was going to just reinforce what Tom said, that really the issue, we have been managing revenue to try to keep that flat impact on taxpayers. This abatement will put us into deficit spending, which kind of puts a clock on the expense side. We either get the expenses in control, and we have improved them markedly, but we need to get them more in control, or we will create large deficits, which will force us into a very difficult referendum situation.
Any other comments? So I hope all those that are listening at home, and when they see this, that the goal here is to be good stewards and to maintain our obligation to our district as well as to our taxpayers. And all of us took that oath and readily understand what that means. And hopefully this will be clearly articulated from the facts that were presented this evening.
And Jack, I do have one remark. I didn't know that no one else would say anything. So I appreciate all that, Tom, you've laid out. And I feel like what the board has done in your time, yours and Jackie's time for 7 years, has been responsive to the concerns that have been raised over that time and even before that time. And tonight's concerns that people articulated are very real and valid. And I think, what we're doing tonight is addressing those well, but not as well as I would like. I know last month I was advocating for a deeper relief than we're already giving. And I'm appreciative that the state has this amazing too good to be true plan where we get a stream of around $300,000 a month on average that helps us provide this abatement. So this abatement is something that is, in my view, an ethical obligation that we have because we're receiving that funding, and that if that funding ever stops, then that it's time for us to reassess whether we continue that. Obviously, that changes the picture. So my vote will be no, and it's a binary yes or no. And so Tom and I spoke earlier this week, and we're not that far apart. And so, in the absence of anyone else moving towards some kind of further relief, I guess this will be just my final remark on this note. So I appreciate again where we've been, but tax to the max for many years is what got this board here before anyone was on the board. And so that's what we're fighting against. And one thing I will mention is the duty we have to our citizens and to our entire community, not just the students and the students' experience here. When I hear phrases, and it wasn't uttered tonight, but I've heard a phrase like leaving money on the table. And just to keep in mind that the table is a shared entity. It's not just ours to have. And so I appreciate that this board is mindful of that, and that we just have a slight difference of philosophy of how deep to go.
And I to that point, that I will say again that District 200 can only do what District 200 can do. And that tax bill comes for all of us, and it is a lump sum. And someone in the community made the analogy that it's maybe 6 taxing bodies, but it's one pocket. Well, our responsibility and what I'm hoping in terms of how we need to communicate is that, some of the comments we heard tonight were about District 97 or about the Park District or about the library. We have no control there, but we are doing our part and have been since I have been on the board. And outside of that, we will never make everybody happy, or anybody maybe, I don't know. But I do feel that conflating our work with others gets real murky, and I appreciate the clarification that was made today, and I think we're ready for the vote.
Mr. Martiri,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Kopsky,
Yes.
Ms. Spivey,
Yes.
Mr. Barron,
No.
Mr. Isley,
Yes.
Dr. Moore.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, now I will move to approve the abatement resolution and ask for a second.
Second.
We discussed it previously. Is there any other comments? Okay.
Mr. Martiri,
Yes.
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Mr. Isley,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Kopsky,
Yes.
Ms. Spivey,
Yes.
and Dr. Moore.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a couple more. Move to approve the school calendars for 2021 and 21-22 and ask for a second.
Second.
Any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
I do want to note that this was a 2-year calendar. Yay.
Big yay for the parents in the community. That's my copy. Okay, now move to approve the bid the award, the 2020 capital improvements, and ask for a second.
Second.
Coming forward, we have.
I know that you've been doing it so well.
FDM has completed the design for the summer portion of the facility master plan in October. During the month of October, every construction starts the bidding process. The scope of the work for the bidding process consisted of electrical panels and feeder replacements, testing of 12 kV electrical switchgear, voice over IP phone system, auditorium lighting controls, and replacement AHU-A1 replacement, I don't know what that is. Transformer vault repairs, roofing replacement, masonry repairs, the fourth floor RTU replacement, and the one west gym ceiling and lighting work. The scope of the work comes to 4.6 million. We're asking for approval tonight for that work not to exceed a funding of $4,583,062 for the 2020 summer construction. This item is in compliance with priority 4 and board policy 4:150. Gentlemen.
So thank you very much. I wanted to introduce Josh Warner, who's from Pepper Construction. I apologize, he should have been noted on the map. So I know there are a lot of questions on the document before you, and I wanted to tell you that in the future we're going to make a better effort to give you more information up front. It was clear that we didn't provide enough information with the documents. We'll rectify that in a future presentation. So Dr. Pruitt-Adams really covered what's happening this summer. A couple of points I wanted to make note of. We are over what was budgeted back in February. In February, we came to this board with an initial estimate of this similar scope. And from February through October, FGM did the design work and basically went out to bid in November. Bids came back in November, and we're coming before the board now with the results of those bids. The over budget item, it's actually not quite 500,000, it's between 380 and 400,000 over, as the numbers are a little lower than we reported here. It was because of the roof, and I'm not going to go into the specific detail, but I do have people here that can tell you a whole lot about what was discovered, why it wasn't discovered sooner, and so on and so forth. So some questions which I wanted to make sure we answered because I think they're germane is the Husky Pup renovation that we discussed. Even though it is in the work order as an allocation, did I say it right? An allowance. It's in there as an allowance. It was put in there as a placeholder. We will come back to the board next month with more information and for approval or not of that amount. But we wanted to put it in here just so it would be in there as a placeholder. So going forward, we would have that. But it is not included in that 4.8 that is listed here. I want to be very clear about that. There was another thing which I'm now forgetting. So I will then, unless there's further questions, I would open it up for questions from the board.
Just to clarify, what are we authorizing in terms of funding in this for 4.8 or 4.1?
4.8.
Okay, so we're authorizing funding for Husky Pup.
I'm sorry, 4.5. I apologize.
4.5.
Yeah.
So the authorization does not include, although it's an allocation as an alternate, what we're authorizing does not include funds to support it per se.
Correct. We will come back with that as a separate item at the committee of the whole next month. That portion of it.
I believe it's here because it was part of the bid package. It's the only reason it's shown now.
Yes, it's really just a placeholder.
Right.
We didn't have time to really flesh out the numbers, that's why it's.
My turn?
It's your turn.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
In the information provided that was a little bit of a historical look back, last year we were 900,000 underspent on our capital, if I recall.
Yes.
Okay, can you, and first of all, I have asked for and would like a longer perspective because this is not a one-piece thing. These are things that we move year to year as we've done over time. So looking at just 1 year, even 2 years, does not really provide me the information to help support my decision-making. Back when we were looking at a 10-year plan, you could see more of the impact of a 10-year plan. So that's been lost, and in my mind, it is needed. So with that said, can you just articulate for what last year, why was it because of we didn't do the scope of work, or because we just had great pricing, or another reason, or number 3?
Just low bidding, it was good pricing.
So we did all the scope of work that was in the plan,
Yes.
and we were, so that, okay, that's helpful in my decision making. Thank you. A second request, again, I feel like the long-term historian here, but as we talk about this work, there's things that just keep coming up and coming up and coming up. And so it would be helpful as we do that to put them in perspective, big picture perspective. I ask, like, air handlers, et cetera. Essentially we're in this work outside of the Imagine the Project One work is about trying to take a 100-year-old building and make it modern, okay, and however we want to define it. So having the perspective of where we are on that would be a helpful thing. How far are we on our journey of replacing and having 21st century air handling, et cetera? That would be helpful as we look at this. So both requests I have are all about kind of a larger picture perspective that we've had and lost, and I'd like to see.
If I may respond to that, I think that's you're spot on with that. One of the things, the trend that I've noticed in the short time I've been involved is we had a plan. So, let's see, someone doesn't want me to say what I need to say.
You can trade.
Is that, am I allowed? Can I
If you
seats?
switch them,
I-
your voice is gonna be his
Mike's
voice.
talking, if you keep talking, it'll pick up again. It's a red dollar, it does.
Well,
See?
boy, it really is late, isn't it?
Oh, it's early.
It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah, okay, so,
He's-
Matt. East Coast.
Yes, sir.
Good.
now, I honestly, I don't even remember what I was gonna say.
You-
No,
You're
all right.
saying what I said was brilliant, and you're gonna.
Yes, that's it. Tom. Yes, exactly. The trend that we had,
Yes.
that is now unfortunately being continued, is that we try to stay within our means, and last year was an exception. Well, we have two issues going on here. One, you've got a budget issue. The other issue you have going on is a time frame issue. Because if you, for example, if we were not in the situation we're in, where all the work has to be done during the summer, we had $800,000 left over, we could have the opportunity to increase the scope and bring other things in that were on the long-term plan. So what happens every year, and it's actually happening again as we get into the Project One work, is we have a limited scope, and you see when there's some kind of an overage, like with the roof right now, we end up pushing out some of that time. So the 10-year plan that was supposed to be executed in 10 years, we're 8 years in, we're probably 5 or 6 years into the plan, if that makes sense. So we haven't been able to get the work done because every year you're constrained by time, and even if you do underspend, you just can't physically get the work done. So we have an opportunity here, and again, Project One is making it easier, and at the same time, it's making it more difficult. Because what's happening is we're opening up new areas of the building, so we have opportunities to build in some of this capital improvement work that's been delayed and basically feed it into the same work. But the dilemma is we still have to stay within our means, right here. So we're basically 400, 500,000 over here. That money's got to be picked up someplace. We're not asking for more money. We're basically going to borrow from the future. So we're going to take things that were slated for some of the out years and push them out further. Not a good way to go, but you've got to live within your means. So that's part of what we're going to be seeing here. And next month when we come back to you, we'll try to give you a view of what's lined up in the next several years, so you get some sense of the future as how it's laying out.
Yeah, in addition, you get with that view, there are things that come up that weren't in a 10-year plan, and that won't be in a 10-year plan. The chimney, right? Those kinds of things, and so at least they're transparent of and what the magnitude of them are. So,
And just to support what Tom's saying, I'd like to see a rolling 10-year plan every year, because things do change, and especially life safety issues and structural issues. They just do. But if we have a rolling 10-year plan, we can budget better, and we can certainly say, well, these are all needs, but these are high priority needs, and move some costs into the future, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that needs to be standard operating procedure.
Yeah, we agree with that. We're planning on doing that. We actually have a plan right now, and we're updating that a little bit more. But we will be able to present that to you and follow through with it, like you're saying, so that you can see that clearly.
Any other comments?
Mr. Isley?
Yes.
Mr. Barron?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Spivey?
Yes.
Mr. Martiri?
Yes.
Mr. Kowski?
yes.
And Dr. Moore?
Yes. Thank you. For your reading pleasure are the information items. Are there any future agenda items? Okay, we got plenty to go into 2020. Stop. send it.
As soon as you said that, next
Okay, so,
So moved.
is there a second?
Second.
Thank you all. Happy holidays,
Happy
everybody.
holidays.
Happy holidays.